The Odyssey seems to be getting a lot of attention lately. You obviously have movies like Christopher Nolan's Adaptation, which just came out a few weeks ago, or The Return, which came out a couple years ago and focuses specifically on Odysseus' return to Ithaca. And then of course you have the sensation that is Epic the Musical, what I believe to be an incredible adaptation of Homer's epic poem, but other people might disagree with me on that one. So with all these adaptations coming out, I thought it would be fun to explore what it is that makes a good adaptation, and specifically why I think Epic is a great adaptation of the Odyssey. Hello and welcome to the Chemist's Codex. My name is Peter and I like to tell stories about whatever catches my interest because I believe those stories can teach us more about ourselves. Now, I haven't really talked about it much on this channel, but I am a massive fan of Epic the Musical. I like the songs, I like the way the story is told, and I think most of the changes made to the story are good. But I know there are people who don't like it, and if you're someone who doesn't like it because you don't like the style of music or you find some of the choices annoying, hey, that's fine. It's your personal taste. I don't care. But there are those who say Epic the Musical is a bad adaptation of the Odyssey, and that's where I have some problems, because I think if you actually take a look at how the Odyssey is constructed and the ways it tells the story, you find that a musical like Epic is actually incredibly well suited to the same story. But before I get into my analysis of why Epic the Musical is such a good adaptation, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss my future videos. And now that you've done that, let's talk about what makes a good adaptation. So what does it take for an adaptation to be considered good? Obviously, this is going to vary from person to person. We're talking about art here, so each person will have their own preferences. But getting beyond the subjectivity of personal taste, I believe there are a few key factors that play an important role. First and foremost is understanding the medium, both the medium you're adapting from and the medium you're adapting to. Because when an adaptation is being made, there will often be the desire to recreate the original beat for beat, creating a one-to-one adaptation, but that never works. As much as fans of the original work might claim they want a beat for beat adaptation, doing so negates the entire point of an adaptation. Something that might work extremely well in a novel isn't going to function the same way in a movie, and something that's fantastic in a movie might be incredibly awful in a stage play. You have to consider the medium you're working with. In a novel, you can take the time to explore a character's feelings through multiple pages of dialogue, inner thoughts, and evocative descriptions. But if you were to try to adapt the same scene for a movie, you might only have to show the character's face for the audience to understand what the character is thinking and feeling. The same level of information that took pages to fully explore in a novel, conveyed with only a few seconds in a movie. So simply by changing mediums, there's going to be inherent changes to the story being told. Scenes will be cut or shuffled around, characters might be merged together, entire plot lines might disappear. But that brings us to the question of what do you keep and what do you throw out? Do you keep a subplot that doesn't meaningfully contribute to the main character's journey? Do you throw out a fan-favorite scene entirely or try to combine it with a different scene? And this is to say, when adapting between mediums, you need to have respect for the source material, but you also cannot be a slave to the source material. Because when you respect the source material, you'll know what it is you need to keep. But if you find yourself a slave to the source material, then you'll be too afraid to throw anything away. But let's dig a little deeper into these ideas. What do I mean when I say you need to have respect for the source material? I don't mean just simply knowing the material and liking it. What I mean is, if you're going to make an adaptation, you should have a solid understanding of the story and its themes and characters. A bad adaptation might have an interesting premise, because the premise of the original is interesting, but then it just runs with the premise without putting in any of the work to understand the characters or the theme. But if an adaptation knows what the theme is, what the point of telling this particular story is, then it doesn't really matter how much of the specific plot details are changed. Those changes were likely made to better service the story being told. And as far as what I mean when I say you can't be a slave to the source material, I've kind of already covered that. This goes back to understanding the medium you're adapting the story to. Just because something works in a novel doesn't mean it will work in a film, so it has to be changed. And you can't be afraid of making those changes. So if you're making an adaptation and you respect the source material and you're okay with making changes and you know what methods work for the medium you're adapting to, then that should make for a good adaptation, right? Well, not necessarily, because there's one other thing that I think is really important, and that's understanding why a scene works on an emotional level. And this is actually something where looking at musicals can really help explain what I mean. Because musicals are inherently emotional. People who dislike musicals tend to ask, why does everyone just burst into song? But what they're failing to understand is the emotion behind the songs. Characters in a musical break into song when their emotions have become too strong for them to hold back, so they start singing to let those emotions out. And then when the emotion becomes too strong yet again, they start dancing. So when you adapt something to be a musical and you want to figure out where to put the musical numbers, you take a look at the source material and find the scenes that have the highest levels of emotion. The same idea holds true for any sort of adaptation, really. When adapting a scene from one medium to another, you need to look at the scene and figure out why that scene works on an emotional level, then recreate that same feeling for the medium you're adapting to. So we've covered the concepts behind what goes into making an adaptation good. Personally, I think one of the most important things to consider is the themes of the original and how it makes the audience feel. Keeping the story's themes consistent between mediums and working to capture the way the story makes the audience feel are going to go a long way in making an adaptation good. Although I do think there's an exception to keeping the themes the same, that being when the story being adapted is extremely well known and has been told multiple times already. Things like Frankenstein, Romeo and Juliet, or the Odyssey. Because when you can assume that your audience already knows the basic premise, plot, and themes of the story you're adapting, you need to give them a reason to care about your adaptation. And so using the story to explore certain themes that might not have been originally intended is a way to achieve that. And we can look at two rather popular and successful adaptations of the Odyssey that do this: Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And the SpongeBob SquarePants movie. Yes, the SpongeBob SquarePants movie is an adaptation of the Odyssey, fight me. Because the Odyssey can be said to have themes around the ideas of homecoming, hospitality, revenge, and justice, among many others. But Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Has themes focusing more about redemption and forgiveness, and the SpongeBob SquarePants movie looks more at themes of embracing who you are and the importance of imagination. Three different sets of themes being explored through the same basic story, simply because the Odyssey is such a well-known and widespread story that the themes don't need to stay the same for an adaptation to be good. So with that in mind, when I talk about Epic the Musical being a good adaptation of the Odyssey, I'm not really talking about the themes the musical explores. Rather, I think it's a good adaptation because of the way the musical is constructed and how that mirrors the way the Odyssey is constructed. So first we should take a look at how the Odyssey is constructed before I get into how Epic mirrors it. And I would like to preface this section by acknowledging that I am not a classicist. I have not studied Homer in any sort of academic sense. And as such, I am pulling my information from the introduction of Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey. Just something I ask you to keep in mind as I present my understanding of the Odyssey. So let's start off by looking at how the Odyssey was written, because something I feel many people forget is that the works of Homer originated as part of an oral tradition during a period of Greek history when people were illiterate. The Odyssey was written down sometime around the 8th century BC, several centuries removed from when the story is meant to take place. And even then, there's still debate about whether Homer was a single person who wrote down the epic or several people working together. The point being, there is still a lot we don't know about who exactly originated the story, who was the first to write the Odyssey down, and when they did so. And kind of related to the question of who wrote the Odyssey, there's also the matter of historical accuracy regarding the story. This is a particular piece of discourse that I have seen a lot recently regarding Christopher Nolan's adaptation, but I have also seen the idea of not being historically accurate thrown at Epic as a reason why it's a bad adaptation. And something I think most people aren't even aware of is that the Odyssey as it was originally written is not meant to be historically accurate. Quoting the introduction of Emily Wilson's translation, "The Homeric poems reflect a mixture of artifacts and practices that existed at different historical times. Indeed, the poems seem to have no interest in conveying an accurate, realistic account of the culture in which they were produced. Rather, they combine elements of a fictionalized, heroicized past with details of the more recent or contemporary world." So historical accuracy is not something that really needs to be considered when discussing the Odyssey. But moving on, let's talk about the language used in the Odyssey and how the poem is laid out, because the language used in the original Greek can be described as simple, which isn't to say it was the common language that was spoken, but rather it wasn't ornate or flowery or basking in its own grandiloquence. And then the poem is written with a rhythmic, almost musical meter, and on top of that, there is a massive amount of repetition. The dawn always shines with rosy fingers, characters always get dressed in the same fashion, food is always prepared with the same ritualistic steps. So we have simple, easy to follow language, lots of repetition, and a deliberate rhythmic meter that borders on music. It all goes back to the idea of this epic poem being performed orally. The repetition and rhythm, once understood, creates a pattern for the audience to recognize, making the story easier to follow. And along with this repetition is the use of epithets, a descriptive term almost like a title that accompanies certain characters. Odysseus is often cunning Odysseus, Penelope is prudent, Athena is bright-eyed. And if the character might be exhibiting behavior that another descriptor might better suit, they are still referred to with their epithet. Again, this helps audiences keep track of who is doing what action because they can remember a character by their epithet. But now I do want to touch on some of the thematic elements of the Odyssey, and where better to start than with Odysseus himself, because the entire driving force of the story is Odysseus' goal of getting home to Ithaca. And the thing about Odysseus is that he's simply a man. He's an exceptional man who achieves amazing feats, but he is still just a man. The first word of the original Greek is andros, a man. Not a specific man, but a man. One of many. But branching out from Odysseus, one of the main focuses of the Odyssey is the juxtaposition of the strange and familiar. The setting is familiar enough to the audience, as it is the world they live in, but this version contains sea monsters and giants and gods who walk the earth. And now I think it's finally time to take a look at Epic the Musical. Because like I said earlier, when I say Epic is a good adaptation of the Odyssey, I'm not talking about the themes the musical touches on. Although I do think one can extrapolate the Odyssey's themes of hospitality to Epic's themes of ruthlessness and mercy. I also mentioned I think Epic is a good adaptation because of how the musical is constructed. And maybe as I was breaking down how the Odyssey is structured, you were able to see how a musical can bear multiple similarities. The Odyssey was deliberately written with a specific meter and rhythm, and obviously a musical is going to have a deliberate rhythm for each song. The rhythm helps a performer to learn the material, and it helps the audience follow along with the performance. Then there's the idea of repetition. Epic the Musical has loads of repetitive musical motifs and melodies, and that's not a bad thing. Motifs repeated throughout a musical serve the purpose of helping the audience track thematic elements throughout the story. There are more easily recognizable motifs, like Just a Man,
Just a man. Just a man. I'm just a man. There is no line. He's just a man. I'm not your man. I'm what you want.
And this particular motif also ties back to the idea that the Odyssey is a story about a man and his desire to return home. But then there's more subtle motifs, like the danger motif, which shows up to signal that danger is near.
There's a motif in Epic called the danger is nearby motif, and it's one of my favorites throughout the show. As the name suggests, it usually appears when danger is nearby in some way, shape, or form. Think of it as that little blue fairy, Navi, from The Legend of Zelda that's like, hey, watch out! Woo! The first time we hear this motif is in the very first song.
And like the Odyssey has epithets for many of its characters, Epic has motifs or even specific instruments that represent many of its characters. Odysseus is represented by a guitar, Penelope is represented by a viola, Athena a piano. So like epithets help an audience keep track of characters, these musical motifs and specific instruments help the audience to recognize specific characters. You can always tell Athena is about to show up when you hear her motif. You can tell how Odysseus is feeling depending on if his guitar is acoustic or electric. You can tell the siren disguised as Penelope is a siren before it's revealed because there's no viola present in the score. So while what's repeated in Epic is different from what's repeated in the Odyssey, the repetition serves the same purpose in both works. Another thing Epic borrows from the Odyssey is the distinction between the familiar and the strange. In Epic, this is done through the score. The human characters, the familiar, will have more traditional orchestral scoring. But the gods and monsters, the strange, will have electronic elements incorporated into the score. And with these similarities in mind, I think what really makes Epic the Musical a good adaptation of the Odyssey is in how, I believe, Epic recreates the way the Odyssey would have felt to its original audience. And I think the perfect example of what I mean lies in the Underworld, because Epic's Underworld saga is probably my favorite saga of the musical. It has this incredible emotionality to it that really connected with me. But Odysseus' journey to speak to the dead in the Odyssey is largely Odysseus saying, I saw this person, and this person, and this person, and this guy's wife, and this guy's daughter, and this guy from the Iliad, and Achilles, and Heracles, and frankly, for a modern audience, I think it's kind of boring. So how does Epic have this incredible emotional sequence where the Odyssey has what is basically a list of names? Well, what I failed to consider at first was what those names would have meant to an ancient Greek audience. Those names were all characters of famous myths and legends that the audience was likely familiar with. Characters that would have provoked an emotional response from the audience. So for an adaptation of the story for a modern audience, you replace the list of names with powerful and emotional pieces of storytelling. A drastic change from the source material that results in the same effect. And that's what I think Epic the Musical does that makes it a fantastic adaptation of the Odyssey. It understands the mediums of the original and the adaptation. It knows what's important to keep, but also isn't afraid to make changes to better serve its own version of the story. And in those changes, it is able to capture the feelings of the original. It takes a story that was wildly popular in antiquity and has endured through the centuries, a story that we can still read and enjoy to this day, and it makes changes to elicit the same feelings and emotions of the original. It tells the story of a man who is yearning for his home, a man who is desperate to get back to the life he left behind, hoping things can return to how they were. A man who finds himself pushed to his limits as he finally returns home and finds it sacked like the city of Troy. And obviously, Epic is by no means a replacement for the Odyssey. You cannot listen to the musical and get the full experience of Homer's poem. But a good adaptation is never a replacement for the original. A good adaptation will embrace the original while telling its own story. It will change things and cut things, but if care is taken and the changes and cuts serve the story being told, then a good adaptation can reach new audiences the original couldn't. And with that new audience, it's almost certain that someone will go and find the original. And I think Epic the Musical achieves that incredibly well. Thanks for watching. I hope you find my argument that Epic is a good adaptation to be convincing. It's something I've put a lot of thought into. This video has been something that's been cooking in the back of my mind for months now. But I want to hear from you. Did I make a point you disagree with? Is there something you think I missed? Let me know down in the comments. Just make sure to keep it respectful. And if you want some more analysis of pop culture, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss my upcoming videos.